How to do that. Good evening and welcome to an all singing, all dancing live performance of the Climate Change Committee. It's quite exciting to be back in a real room and good to see everyone. As I explained to someone earlier, the last time I was in a public meeting, I had a short haircut and promised I would cut it once the pandemic was over, and here we are. So, okay, the agenda. Declarations of interest. Does anyone wish to make a declaration of interest? I'm not seeing one. The next thing are the minutes on page 1. Is there anything that people would like to add, correct, amend from there? Yeah.
No, I'm happy with the minutes as they are, but yet again, this is yet another set of minutes that we're approving, where yet again in the minutes we've asked for information from the Climate Commission, and yet again we still haven't got that information. It's been a lot of meetings in a row of of minuting our request for some information.
Yeah, I think it's a fair point. So, well, it's now been aired publicly. When can we expect something to come?
An update on the latest meeting of the Climate Commission was circulated with the monthly climate change e-newsletter, which went out this week or last week. So that's a good plug if you're not signed up to the monthly climate change e-newsletter to sign up for it, but I can send it directly to all members of this meeting, of this scrutiny committee as well.
That would be good, I'm sure, yeah.
Thank you, that's great. That's one of the things we asked for. And the other thing was some information about which local organisations and companies have been approached and how and who by. I think that was some information that wasn't necessarily clear if that could be public or whether it, in any report, or whether it might just be information that's shared privately with us as members as appropriate. But I think it's close to a year ago now, wasn't it, that we requested that information?
It is a long time ago, yeah. It is, you're right.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, point take. I'll see if that can be presented in a format to you.
Thank you. I mean, it's been part of this whole COVID process is that we've all become so disconnected from each other, and now we are meeting again. It would be hugely helpful if we could get more coordination. And I think we agreed at the last meeting as well that we would be inviting to forthcoming meetings someone to come from the Climate Change Commission to come and talk to us, because I think that would be nice to have a live relationship with that body. I don't know if we've made any progress on that since the last meeting.
So Sean's our contact in the Climate Change Commission, and he provides the update for the e-newsletter. When we've shared the list of attendees, maybe that's the way to start thinking about who would be most appropriate, if not Sean. So Sean is our link into the Climate Commission from this meeting, but there might be someone more appropriate or someone else you'd like to talk to, so that's fine.
Right. Okay, thank you. Are there any other comments that people have about the minutes? No. Okay. I mean, the only thing that I noted from this, and I know that the minutes are always shorthand, but I have to say I noticed that there wasn't reference to the discussion we had about mass transit and going forwards in terms of the questionnaire and resident engagement. And there is talk in here about how we need to engage with residents in the conversation, big conversation, going forwards in new and more visionary ways. But I do just want to make a note of the fact that we did talk about the fact that the survey as it took place talked about walking and cycling and public transport, buses specifically, and cars, and not more than that. And I think there was a general feeling that we needed to be more dynamic going forwards if we're going to really get an informed and engaged public. And in fact, there was one phrase that was picked out in the presentation for us, where I think public were asked, what do you think of our plan? And the answer came back, what plan? And I know there are always going to be misanthropes who want to say that at anything, any council does at any time. But it does nonetheless highlight, I think, the need for us to be leading brightly with vision and ideas. So I just wanted to note that. But so aside from that, I'm not seeing anyone wanting to change anything else in what we've got there. So I will sign those. Is this the copy? It's all so exciting and new, actually, having to do things in the real world again. There you go. Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, so number 3, public participation. We've got 2 people, one of whom is in the room and one of whom is on Zoom. I think the first person here on my list is Debbie Cobbett on Zoom. So can you hear us, Debbie?
Hello, can you hear me?
We can indeed.
Good, excellent.
3 minutes.
Before my 3 minutes, I was just wondering if you were talking about a climate update, and I wondered if that's available to members of the public.
Yes, is the answer to that, Debbie. So where will
So
We'll circulate the link. It's via the council website. You can register for an e-newsletter update.
okay.
But we'll circulate the link with the minutes so that actually anyone who can look at the minutes can see where to go. Thank you.
Thank you very much, because I do find the council website rather a labyrinth, but thank you for that. Okay, first of all, I hope that everybody enjoyed York Environment Week, which I consider was quite a success with a very varied programme. And I would suggest, if you missed it, that you should catch up with the MedAct event. It was called What Has Climate Got to Do with Health, or What Has Health Got to Do with Climate? And I think it suggests very, very strongly that you need to be talking to your public health team about all the dreadful things that are coming down the line affecting people's health. And today I was sent the link to a World Health Organization paper about climate and health, and it's going to be part of COP26 as well. That I think it just shows that your climate action strategy needs to be about far, far, far more than carbon reduction. It needs to be about building resilience amongst communities, especially the most vulnerable, but all of us might be threatened by different diseases, heat waves, flooding, as we all know about in York. But certainly the health impacts are quite mind-boggling. A piece of information for you is that Chloe Wilcox, that you, I think, co-opted onto your committee, has moved on, and the young people now have a new representative, and I can send the email address to Councillor Vassie so that you can contact them. On the substantive stuff in your reports and papers, I share the councillors' concern that there was no mention in the papers of this climate commission, and I think that's quite very disquieting. I have been following the Yorkshire and Humber Climate Commission They have a much, much broader representation. They contact trade unionists, they reach out in all kinds of ways, and they're not just a bunch of employers and managers getting together or not getting together for all we know. I think that you really need a much broader dialogue with people across York, and that should include trade unionists. As a trade unionist, I want to see not just carbon reduction, I want to see a just transition to a green economy. That means decent jobs, it means fair pay, it means decent terms and conditions. And the trade union movement have had things about this for well over a decade. The Campaign Against Climate Change published 1 million climate jobs and are currently updating, I think it's going to be the 5th edition. And, you know, we cannot go through another unjust transition when jobs like mining, you know, or steel in South Yorkshire, we've seen what an unjust transition looks like in Yorkshire. We don't want another one. And I think, you know, it's very disquieting to see the discrepancy in job creation between your papers, which talk about 300 or so jobs, and other calculations that talk about 3,000. And I cannot get a straight answer about what that discrepancy is down to. The latest thing was something to do with grandfathers or grandfathering the data. So, you know, trade unionists want to see decent jobs. They're going to resist otherwise. You know, they want to carry on installing gas boilers or, you know, working in airports, whereas that's going to obviously increase carbon emissions. Yeah, I think those are my key points, that, you know, a just transition and involve trade unions and make your climate commission a bit more meaningful, please.
Thank you very much for that. Your points are well made and they will no doubt feature in our discussions, Debbie. Thank you. I'll now call our second speaker, Gwen Swinburne, who is in the room. Gwen, welcome, and you have 3 minutes to address us.
I may just before, I received the email regarding the climate change, whatever that's circulated around. It actually only has 4 paragraphs on. I thought it might have a link to agenda and minutes, but it just has 4 brief paragraphs. So I didn't find it very fulfilling or useful myself, but that's just how we go. Sorry. Okay. Okay. Thank you, Chair. Thank you for accepting my late registration, and forgive me if the remarks I make have been made in an earlier meeting. First, Chair, we are all aware that all of our most senior staff live a very long way away. The back end of Lincolnshire, Staffordshire, Lancashire, and until recently, the head of service in the Shetland Islands. Scarborough is close compared to these top managers. Besides the perceived complete lack of commitment to York, these senior managers, and no doubt many others, who are the first to talk about climate change, are all happy to undertake these climate disastrous long commutes. A complete disconnect between the talk and the walk. No doubt a great excuse not to turn up to the office. Secondly, may I ask that, related to this, an anonymised piece of work be undertaken to establish the number and grades of staff living under 25, 25 to 50, and so on, miles away, and to establish the quantum of this problem and the modes of transport they use? And can we have an audit parallel to check on staff parking and petrol privileges, if there are any? There have been. Finally, it'd be beneficial to understand what can be done regarding only recruiting those willing to live locally. I'm not sure what the law provides, because besides the environmental damage, these commutes mean that top managers are unlikely to be committed to York, as we see with the recently promoted, now departed corporate director of people. Next, Chair, at the other extreme, the amount of paper waste from badly formatted committee reports is a scandal. Most agendas I see could easily be reduced by 1/3. We need to reformat standardized items, address footers and margins, and have much tighter reports. We could save loads of paper. Chair, now looking on your forward plan, the big picture again, I would have hoped to see on an item on the Constitution. It is important that each scrutiny committee addresses this, particularly yours, and not just your own terms of reference, but a wider review to make sure the Constitution at every point meets the climate emergency obligations that you have committed to. Finally, I will express my concerns here, as I have in other places. I am surprised to see what are being called informal forums in your history and forward plan, as these appear to be under the radar, excluding the public, and simply a way to avoid full meetings. I am concerned these are happening at all. Could you ask your statutory designated scrutiny officer to enlighten us regarding the legality of these forums? Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Thank you for your contribution, and I'm sure that too may pop up in our discussions. Thank you. Right. So I need to remind everyone about webcasting, which I should have done earlier, to remind you all that we are being webcast and that people may or may not be looking at our proceedings, and to be aware of that. Yes.
On that note, when we discussed apologies earlier, were we streaming at that point, or was that before we went live?
Yes. Yeah. True. Yes. So we haven't yet listed apologies. So in attendance, Councillor Barnes is not with us, unfortunately, today, and Councillor Fisher has been substituted by Councillor Pearson, and I understand that Councillor Baker has also sent an apology. So to clarify that, was there anything else you wanted to have noted, Councillor Mellon? No, that's okay. I should have done that. You're right to point it out. Okay, so let's move on now to our first agenda item, the climate change strategy update on page 5. And am I right in thinking you're doing this one, Claire, or is it Sean?
Yeah, I can do this one. It's pretty quick. So as you can see on page 5, we've already undertaken a series of steps to develop the climate change strategy. Indeed, today you'll see, or you've seen the evidence, or some of the evidence supporting that, for the emission reports and the engagement reports. The next stage, we're currently undergoing officer review to make sure some of the actions are feasible and deliverable. Our next stage is public consultation and stage 3 engagement, which actually picks up on the point you made earlier, Councillor Bassi, around the survey and the scale of our ambition. So we'll be picking that up through the stage 3 engagement. You can see that our next steps are essentially the public consultation, which we hope will take place with your good selves and obviously the public at large, November, end of October, November time, hopefully. We'll update the strategy design and make sure it's accessible for a wide audience, so it's readable and it's understandable, and then aim to publish it in the new year, early in 2022.
Thank you. Can I, before inviting questions from members, just note that it doesn't actually say who the stakeholders are that have been consulted with in this document when we get to pages 6 to whatever it is, 14. Can you tell us who those groups were?
Yeah, we've got a list of the 35 organisations, so we can share that with the minutes.
That would be good. That would be helpful, yes. It's just a bit difficult to form a view as to who it is saying what if we don't know who those individuals are. Do members have any comments to make on all of this? Yes, Councillor Mellon.
Thanks. Yeah, thank you for the update on how everything's been going so far and the plan for getting the strategy completed. When was the strategy originally supposed to be completed? Has it been delayed at any point? And if so, what have the delays been?
It's been delayed by about 6 weeks, and that's been a combination of sadly COVID affecting the people that are pulling it together, delays in the actual engagement process with residents and getting as much detailed information together as possible, some of which you've seen in the minutes in the report today. So it's a combination of different factors, so it has delayed us slightly, but we're still on track. We're still hoping to get it out, and you'll still have ample opportunity to comment on it. So, okay.
Thank you. Yes, Councillor. Yes, there, Councillor.
Thank you. Could you say a little bit more about what the stage 3 consultation engagement is going to look like?
So we're talking, it's all very exploratory at the moment, so I wouldn't like to commit, but we are looking at some sort of mobile engagement thing that can travel around the city, probably in our libraries, that talk to people about what's possible now and what's possible in other cities and what the ambition could be, to try and get an idea of one of the things you'll see in the report actually is the extent to which residents accept there's a problem is massive, as you'd expect. The extent to which residents accept that maybe there will need to be a change in our own behaviours is different. So we need to do some sort of engagement that helps residents understand what they can do feasibly now, what they need to think about differently, and then what our lives might all need to be like if we were to deliver this for the ambition of 2030, because actually we are talking about a transformative change, as you know, and that needs to be discussed further about level of acceptability, level of kind of commitment to that, etc., etc.
If I can make a few responses to the perspectives that are listed between pages 7 and 12. As I said earlier, it would help to know who the stakeholders are, but you'll be giving us that information. One thing that struck me several times is the degree to which I think we have a part to help lead this discussion. So when I see discussions on energy, for example, and I only really see stuff about carbon capture and storage, I'm immediately wondering, well, who are the people who only see energy and the transition in terms of carbon capture and storage? Why is there no reference to green hydrogen? And there are no doubt many other things that should be a part of that. And I'd just like to get your feedback from the officer perspective as to how you think we're going to ensure that we bring in that vision stuff in, so that the debate is moved on from what I would see here, and again, I don't know who you've been speaking with, but carbon capture and storage, I would see as being something of great interest to a few particular major players, because it can be described as things that would appeal to the big energy companies as they are now. But things like green hydrogen and all of those things require a step change in thinking and may require different players to get involved. So I'm just keen to get an idea of how you see us reaching out to people with this big picture stuff, so that our strategy can really be visionary and really encourage all the stakeholders, including residents, to see the big picture.
Yeah, so I suppose carbon capture storage is a big ticket item. It's interesting to talk about in sessions like this, but it's not the priority for the city or the strategy. If we were looking at a hierarchy of energy interventions, it would be fairly low down the list. You'd have increasing local renewable generation towards the top of that list, along with reducing total energy demand for the city. And there are lots of conversations happening about how we can increase local renewable generation through solar panels, wind generation, heat pumps, and using the city's assets as an energy source as well. Conversations at the same stakeholder meeting that I was involved in around the use of the river as a potential energy source for the city and other options that are available to us. So those conversations are happening amongst stakeholders. I think at a local level for residents, the stuff that we can do, information provision that we can provide to demonstrate the benefits of solar panels and renewable generation, what the co-benefits are, what the financial benefits, financial implications are, and also putting them in touch with local suppliers who are able to deliver those solutions as well. So there's a number of things we can do from the communication side.
Thank you. Yes, and so I'll just respond and then bring you in, Councillor Parrott. So other things that spring to mind as you're speaking, Sean, are things like the local energy plan and devolution and all of that, because those will have a direct bearing on residents and local businesses once we start to bring a local energy plan and integrate it into our planning documents. Are we looking to put that kind of stuff into this next level of consultation and into the exhibition that you raised earlier, Claire, to start getting people talking about all that kind of stuff? Are we looking to put that in our plans?
Yeah, we have a plan to produce a local area energy plan for York, and whilst it's a technical piece of work, the vast majority, the bulk of the work is stakeholder engagement and understanding where those opportunities lie and what it would take to realise those opportunities as well. So we have a funding application at the moment to produce that local area energy plan. Hopefully we're successful with that, and then that piece of work can commence.
Good. Yes, if it's just feeding on from that before I call Councillor Parrott, yeah.
If that funding bid isn't successful, which I really hope it is, will it still be possible to develop that plan?
We'll look at other funding sources for that.
Councillor Parrott.
Thanks, Chair. My question was a little bit similar to your own, actually. So it was around how we'd sort of framed that roundtable, because obviously what we're getting here in stakeholder perspective is the challenge areas, and you do mention that we're identifying sort of the opportunities as well. And I know it's premature to be asking about them because that comes later with the objectives work, but did we get good ideas from everybody that was involved there? How do people sort of feed in their ideas for the vision? I know sort of the speaker that we just had's obviously done loads of research. How do people get involved and share things? Because I know consultation is generally a bit limited, isn't it, with sort of how much information you can give for answers, and sometimes questions sort of lead you to give certain answers and don't always give you the freedom to just explore really out there ideas. So how do we bring people with us and sort of shift that narrative? Because I think one of the ones that was concerning me around the challenge areas was community, and it's sort of all these mentions of behaviour and sort of the challenges there of how we nudge people and sort of change attitudes, work on education, that kind of thing. So the more we can bring members of the public with us now probably would help with some of those solutions later, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally agree. Bringing people with us, fostering an atmosphere of collaboration and cooperation across the city will be absolute pillars of the strategy, core principles that we'll be looking to deliver, along with the carbon reduction as standard. And you're quite right to suggest that there might be opportunities that we've missed through this stakeholder engagement. The public consultation will hopefully help draw those out, and then there is scope to obviously include those in the strategy if it's appropriate.
Thank you. That brings us on to the next agenda item in a sense. Sorry, Councillor Mary. Councillor Mary, yeah. You want, sorry? Yeah, of course.
Thanks, Chair. I was just wondering, there's a huge amount of information from this big conversation. It's been interesting to read it. Have there been any surprising results for you that will, change what was planned for the strategy?
No huge shocks, I think. I think that the whole point of us doing the public attitude survey without a combined information provision was to get that unfiltered perspective of what residents thought without being fed and perhaps without being fed information that could create bias in their opinions. We've got that unfiltered response from residents now. I think there's some really interesting responses in there, a lot of them confirming perhaps what we might have already thought, but until you do the work, you can't say for certain that that's what you're going to get. Now we've got that will help us frame that phase 3 engagement that Claire was talking about earlier. What does that messaging look like? Which groups do we target? Which messages resonate most with different groups? There's a huge amount of insight for us to go through to help shape that phase 3 work.
Thank you. And I hope that you're both getting the encouragement that all the members simply want to see progress and vision and ideas. I think it's fair to say we all want this agenda to succeed. So I hope you feel encouraged. We'll move on because they're all linked. I'd like to just move on now and note that we've seen the strategy update, move on to the engagement update. And this largely comes out of the presentation we had at our last meeting and the concerns that were expressed by various people around the table about the way the information had been presented to us and the difficulties we had in getting down into the demographics and properly starting to understand how the responses that we'd been given fitted to either different age groups or to different wards, etc., etc. So would you like to just introduce it and kind of give us an idea of what we've got this time round?
Yes. Sorry, you go. Sorry.
Well, yeah, I was just going to say that I think the agenda's probably been presented a little bit back to front because the stakeholder perspectives was what we labelled as stage 2 of our engagement process, thematic roundtables around the key topics that we're talking about. The public engagement survey was stage 1 of our engagement process. There was a presentation on the findings at the last meeting, and this hopefully is going some way to satisfy your curiosity at the greater level of detail. As mentioned, this greater level of insight is designed to support the future rounds of engagement, phase 3, to help us understand where people are, where they want to get to, and how they want to get to that point. You asked me if there was any big surprises from this earlier, Chair. I suppose mentions of waste and recycling featured heavily in the open comment responses generally, which are a reflection of what's important for people locally, but also what people consider as contributing to carbon emissions across the city. What we've seen from the modelling work that's presented in a later agenda item is that waste actually contributes quite a small amount of our citywide emissions. And while any action is positive action, what we really need to be doing is trying to shift attention to those big ticket items of addressing emissions from our buildings and our transport system. A couple of demographic things to pick up from the presentation. I won't go through all of them because there's a huge amount of information there. But from a gender perspective, females less likely to cycle, again, perhaps not surprising, but they do want better access to sustainable travel and public transport infrastructure to support them to do that more. Males are less likely to have undertaken work-related training in the last 5 years. There are implications there for the upskilling that we'll need to deliver all of the carbon reduction interventions that we'll need to see over the last 10 years. But males are more likely to shift to more flexible ways of working post-pandemic. From an age perspective, for young people, cost is a significant barrier to action. Again, can influence our messaging and what types of interventions we offer that age group. But they do make less than 1/5 of their journeys by car. Older people cite a lack of information as a barrier to action, again influencing our engagement strategy. But they have taken action to reduce personal vehicle usage in the last 12 months.
Thank you. Yes, Councillor Murphy.
Sorry, Chair. Yeah, my
That's
question
okay.
earlier, I'd accidentally moved on to this agenda item. So yeah, that question about surprises was relating to this agenda item. But yeah, no, I think that's really interesting what you're just saying about work and training, because yeah, the under 40s were more likely to be kind of underemployed, you know, working part-time because appropriate full-time work isn't available, and were the most likely to say that cost was a barrier to making changes. So that seems like a really important target for providing training and jobs for younger people and in a just transition. Yeah. Can I say what I found surprising? Answer my own question. It was a bit about 25% of under 40s say they expected to drive more in the next 5 years. That seems like an obvious.
It could well be
target as
that a lot
well.
of those aren't driving right now or are just taking their driving lessons, and so expect to have a vehicle ownership in the next few years. Yeah, we don't know what's behind that data, but on the surface it might seem surprising, but it could be explained by the fact they're just not driving right now and hope to be in a few years' time.
I mean, to respond to what you've just said there, Councillor Melly, and when I was looking through these, the first thing that struck me is just to remind myself that we're talking about 1,200 responses in a city of 200,000 people. The second thing is that I think 47% of those responded were over 60. Whereas in the population at large, I think the over 60s are about a third of the population of York as a percentage. And it really left me hungry to work with officers, for councillors to work with officers to develop new ways of reaching to people so that we genuinely get loads of people participating and a proper spread across the age ranges, because I know that in these kind of things you can just weight it and say, oh well, you know, we'll adjust the weight so that the 60-year-olds are just no more than anyone else. But you're still left with the information gap of what the people who are not over 60s think, and somehow we've got to get around that. We've got to, in my view, if we're going to tackle climate change, we've got to get past that, because among the many things that interested me in these responses was that when people were asked, what could we do? What should we do? People over 60s were saying, well, we could use glass bottles instead of plastic bottles. And I understand why. They're going back to their childhood and what happened when they were kids. But younger people were making a much broader set of comments that showed that their engagement with climate issues is broader and more related in the period we're at now. And surely as a city, our challenge is to bring all of those voices to make sure they're all heard, and that we don't get bogged down in discussions that are weighted almost haphazardly as a result of the process by which we've engaged people. I'd be really pleased to hear your thoughts as officers as to how you think going forwards we're going to be able to do that differently.
So, yeah, thanks, Councillor. So this was the attitudinal survey that we just wanted to just send out and see who responded. And part of our understanding of who's interested is in a sense who's responded. We're really hoping through stage 3 that we can reach and target more people, and we'll be using the feedback to shape the messaging and the participants to shape who we should go to, essentially, and where we should go and which areas of the city we should target. We've touched on stage 3 and a pop-up kind of, I mean, it's an exhibition is probably too much, but a little roadshow that goes about and gives people an idea and an opportunity to talk about, you know, hypotheticals and what's possible and what other cities are doing and where we could take this and what they're responsible for, what we're responsible for, how we can work together, all of that kind of bringing this all together for sort of a co-created some new ideas. But you're absolutely right. There's more we can do using this survey to get under the skin of where have we missed, which locations have we missed, which demographics have we missed, and also which working kind of characteristics have we missed, so that we make sure that we can reach as many people as possible. At the moment, we're doing, if you like, a gap analysis to see where and see who we need to target. We don't yet have an answer as to how we're going to target those people.
Right, okay. Yes. Sure.
Yeah, just to, I think, broad participation in public surveys and consultations is not just a challenge for climate change and carbon reduction strategy. It's something that every council department is wanting to increase in their own service area. And there's lessons to be learned from the successful waste and recycling consultation. There's local transport plan happening as well. There's further consultation and engagement processes to happen with the economic strategy. We can all learn and improve from each other and continue to explore new routes for broader participation.
Yeah. Yes, Councillor Pearce.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, am I okay to move on? I'm looking at page sort of 28, 29 and 30 at the moment, which is about the bus networks. And obviously I'm biased because I'm from Haxby and Wigginton and I'm representing that area, but I noticed that YO32 postcode, they're the most likely to say that the bus networks is appropriate and very or quite effective for them. But they're also the most likely to say, I think that's right, that a more extensive transport network would be very or quite effective in encouraging sustainable travel. I just wondered if you noticed that kind of trend. It seems also to correlate with obviously suburban areas where obviously I think they've, as a sort of transport planner, my gut feeling is that it's those spokes are good, but it's the orbital routes where we need to concentrate on improving our transport networks. Is that the kind of flavour you're getting? And what more investigations are we going to do to find out if that's...
Yeah, it's a good observation. I think that level of detail will start to come out in the development of the local transport plan, which I think we'll hear about a bit later. But yeah, so the climate change strategy, carbon reduction strategy engagement took place simultaneously with the economic development strategy and the local transport plan engagement to do exactly that, join the dots between those strategies, see where the synergies existed so that we could develop those three strategies and make sure that interventions were integrated that way.
Yeah, I have to say, when I looked at all of this, on one level, my ward is probably the least engaged ward in the city on the issues of public transport and getting out of your cars. And essentially, I think we're needing to recognise, and I'm really glad to see the information presented differently this time around, because if we just talk about people in York think this of the buses, we're really not getting anywhere close to the challenge that we face. And the climate change strategy, by definition, seeks to admit that we're all in this together. But until we find a way of reconciling those very different experiences across the city, we're going to struggle to create any coherent narrative that people can buy into. So while it kind of made for a slightly depressing reading to see time and time again my ward being at the bottom of the pile of engaging with all this stuff, I do recognise the fact that there are villages in my ward where if they get 4 buses a day, they're feeling things are going up, and the buses come at different times on different days, and all that kind of stuff is really not going to lead us where we need to go. And again, when we ask the next series of questions, as Councillor Pearson has said, I think it would be helpful if those questions encourage the public to start thinking about the big picture, to see their own ward, to see the wider city, to see the bigger context. I mean, would you agree that there's a temptation for us all to just answer these questions purely in terms of our own immediate experience, and that it can be quite tricky to step out beyond our own immediate experience and see the city as a city? Would you agree that that's one of the things our questionnaire should really be helping to develop for residents and businesses alike?
Yeah, thanks, Councillor. I mean, absolutely agree. The purpose of this survey was for people's own experiences.
Yeah.
And stage one was very much about your personal attitude. Stage three is about, here's the climate change ambition. This is what we need to achieve. We know we've got a gap. We know we need to work together. What's our opportunities? Where can we take this? What can we do together? The practical, so, you know, we've talked about people who are maybe underemployed, feeling they don't have enough money. Well, what can you do then? But also the aspirational and the inspirational. So the pop-up, whatever we want to call it, is going to have to work hard. It's not necessarily going to take a place of a survey either. It's actually about conversation, about leaving comments, about, you know, exploring ideas, not the traditional online survey that we expect people to complete.
Yeah. And then I think there's such an opportunity to engage the energies and talents of our residents by helping them understand best practice, by helping them think about the best city, a wider city. And the individual responses we had on page 16, for me, were very telling. And I know these are just one-off individuals, and it's important not to overgeneralize it. But when I see the over 60s talking principally, and I imagine these are indicative of the kind of responses you got. But when there are lots of comments from over 65s about reuse and repair and glass bottles for milk and all of that, and then you've got young people or younger people talking about, with a huge long list of things that can be done: fly less, drive electric, insulate your home, wear clothes to last, lobby Parliament, walk and cycle more, cut your food waste, dial down the thermostat, eat more plants. A huge, that demonstrates a level of engagement that I think certainly fits with my experience of a generation gap. And it goes back to what I said earlier and the comments that others have made about making sure we harness that energy. Are there any other comments on all this? Councillor Perrott, yes.
I suppose it follows on from what you were saying around that sort of age gap, but I was a bit disappointed to see the numbers of people that were feeling optimistic about career prospects. So the under 40s was 49%, and where am I? 40s 59, it was, where am I? 25% disagreed that they felt optimistic. And I think it is, you know, when you think about the idea of just transitions and how we could be having all of these amazing green jobs, we can be upskilling people. I think there's a lot of opportunities, and it's about how we sort of get across to people that these are careers that they could be working in, that these are the jobs of the future, these are the things we need to be getting children interested in, but also letting everybody else know you could retrain. And it's about how we talk about those incentives. And I think it's just really key, isn't it, that we get this vision right, and that we give people an opportunity to feed in what they would like to see as part of that vision, because right now it feels like there's that big gap for under 40s who are saying we can't afford to do this, and how do we say, okay, this is how we get you to a point where you can be more of a part of this city, you feel like you've got better prospects, you feel like you can really sort of contribute to it. And yeah, I've got no easy answers for how we do that, but yeah, I was just a little bit sort of shocked that the optimism wasn't necessarily there for career opportunities. And I think that is a really key part of what, if we do this right, you know, and have this Green New Deal kind of idea, if we have this just transition, it could be an amazing opportunity for us to upskill people. And I just don't think that we're quite there with people knowing that, you know, we could be doing that.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Councillor Perrott. I mean, it's a moment in time, isn't it? And actually, if we think about where people have come from during the most awful last couple of years, and so many furlough schemes and job losses, and, you know, really affecting that younger generation, you can understand why the optimism is low. What you've described, of course, is what we're hoping to achieve, at least in some part, through the devolution deal, hopefully. Some of that's going to be reflected, or it will be reflected in the economic strategy. And I wonder if at the next scrutiny, you might like to invite our head of economic growth to talk about the economic strategy, because actually those key points that you're talking about would be part of that economic strategy. And that's where climate change touches so many different parts of the council. It's, you know, it's not just one team, it's actually the whole of the council is looking at various different elements that contribute to a green economy, health and well-being, all those different things that have been talked about today.
Yeah.
And not to steal the head of economic growth's thunder before they speak at the next meeting, but we're working very closely in collaboration with the economic development team, with the skills team, because you're right, there's a huge opportunity that presents itself here that, for example, if we're looking to retrofit all of our homes across the city to deliver our carbon reduction targets, there are potential careers in building retrofit installation, heat pump installation, all of these jobs that have not been traditional careers that could now be legitimate careers for people who are in training right now. And we're working hard to get that message out there that there is a huge opportunity from this.
Councillor Melly, yeah.
Thanks, Chair. I was going to change the subject slightly and go back to what you said, somebody said about buses, because I think so far we've been really successful. The council and local bus service providers have been really successful at upgrading and updating their vehicles to be electric or Euro 6 standard and that sort of thing, and that's really great. But the real climate change advantage and potential of buses isn't just in the emissions that they produce, it's in the emissions that they prevent by providing an alternative to private vehicle. And I think there's so many people in the city who are encouraging walking and cycling is really important. But there's a lot of people who can't do that for whatever reason, whether it's the distances they need to travel or injury or disability or time of day that they're traveling or whatever. And the bus is really the only alternative to private vehicle for a lot of people in terms of reducing reliability on cars. So I think there's a lot of really important work that needs doing on buses that can't wait until this climate strategy is complete, because the funding being offered from the government and that sort of thing is it needs applying for that. And I think the bus service improvement plan was published yesterday, but I haven't had a chance to read it yet. But presumably there's more consultation and input into that.
Yeah.
I
don't know if Sean's got any more to. This is the moment where I get everyone to take their tram bingo cards out, because I'm going to mention the tram word again. The bottom line is that when we look at modal split, I was looking at modal splits today before coming to the meeting. Where we are in our region is quite good. You can say, well, you compare us to Huddersfield and Leeds, we're doing all right. But when you compare us to Vienna, where 39% of all journeys are by public transport, or Stockholm, where 43% of all journeys are by public transport, and the list goes on, and then you find we're at about 11%. We may be doing all right in the region, but when we're looking at the scale of our challenge and trying to create a zero carbon pathway for the future, it's clear that we've got a lot of thinking to do. And in my view, we've got to go way beyond just talking about putting on a couple of extra bus services. But that's part of why I think this opportunity of the stage 3 of the consultation is a big one. That I think if we can shine a light on various other cities that in many ways are quite like our own city, beautiful historic cities that actually have huge amounts of people on public transport, we might start to be able to have the difficult conversation that moves us on beyond damage limitation all the time to a better place. And just to respond to what Councillor Perrett said and what was said earlier by Debbie Cobbett, I think it would be good to have your view, Claire, on the Climate Commission and who is actually on it, because I think it is a good point that trades unionists should be part of that discussion. They need to be part of that discussion. So can you give us an idea of who is on that and whether there is representation from trades unions and how we see that going forwards. Yeah, sure.
Yes, I can give you an idea of who's on it. So the Commission has representation from public, private and third sector organisations across the city. They won't thank me for saying this, but the 3 largest single source emitters of the city are also represented on the Climate Commission, and big employers are on there as well. Nestle, the hospital, University of York, Chamber of Commerce represented on there. But there is no, at the moment, there is no trade union representation.
Yeah, well, what does everyone, I mean, we've heard what Councillor Perrott thinks. What does everyone around the table think about that? Do we think it would be a good idea to ensure that there was that broader representation going forwards? Yes.
We just need to be mindful that with private sector employees, there are different trade unions at play here, so not just our own, but other trade unions. So it's probably a conversation to have with the Climate Commission about a trade union representative for all of them, rather than every trade union representative.
That makes sense. I understand what you're saying. Sorry, yes, Councillor Brent, Councillor.
We're probably going to make the same point, but TUC would probably be the best one, just because that's the council that brings them all together. So yeah, that would probably be the one I'd suggest reaching out to. Was that the same point you wanted to make?
I was going to say that in general, my general mantra for everything is more trade union involvement in everything, please. But I feel like I'd have to go back and look at the terms of reference of exactly what this commission is aiming to achieve and who's on it and what the requirements are for being on it and that sort of thing before making any sort of recommendation today of what would be appropriate.
It was just a general thing. I'm not trying to pin anyone down. I'm just trying to get a sense. I'm hoping that officers can get a sense of the mood in the room as to whether there is a part that could be played by trades unions on the Climate Commission. That's basically the idea. I mean, I understand the health service are part of it, and obviously the CCG is part of the Climate Change Commission. Is that right? Are they? The hospital, yes, they're playing a part. And to respond to what one of the public speakers said earlier, I've certainly attended a MedAct meeting and was really impressed at the level of engagement of the health service in general and our hospital in particular on the climate agenda. So I'm hopeful that they're playing a significant role on the Climate Commission. It'll be good when we get a report and hear more. Are there other comments on the engagement update? Or are we done with that? So, well, thank you for getting us this more thorough breakdown of the information. It was very helpful, and I hope officers have found it helpful as well, because you've no doubt been given the time to look at it in a different way to prepare the information. Differently.
It's really helpful thinking around stage 3. So we haven't got the answers, but we needed that evidence base to start planning out for stage 3. So yeah, it was helpful. Thank you.
Good, thank you. So we now move on to our last substantive issue, emissions update. Sorry, yes, Councillor.
I was wondering if we could please take a short break before we move on to the next agenda item.
Yeah, if you do. Yes, let's take a 5-minute comfort break. Okay. Yes, if that's okay. Thank you. Okay, welcome back. And we're now going to have an update on the local transport plan from Julian Ridge.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sorry, I haven't done this before. Thank you very much. Julian Ridge, Sustainable Transport Manager for City of York Council. Obviously, we've been working with colleagues both in comms and alongside Sean's strategy and the economic strategy as it rolls forward to progress the local transport plan. Transport has a sort of multiple role in relation to climate change because it both enables forms of behaviour which can reduce York's impact on carbon emissions, but transport itself emits quite large amounts of carbon. So there are things that we can do entirely within the transport network, which have a very positive effect on carbon emissions if we get them right. Obviously, we're working on the longer term transport plan, and the intention is that we will be publishing a broad document with overarching policies in it in the first quarter of 2022. But the big development, I suppose, which has happened in the last week has been the publication of our bus service improvement plan. I'm aware it came out, I think, yesterday, so I'm not expecting everybody to have read it 60 pages in detail. It does include some very substantial measures which will reduce the carbon impact of transport in York generally. I mean, on two fronts, really. The first front is that directly includes a bid for £12 million, which would allow the whole of the York urban bus fleet to be converted to electric power from diesel, alongside the bid that we have in with the Department of Transport at the moment for £9 million of funding, which would convert, I think, 44 vehicles which are used across the city. So this would be in addition to that. There are about 150 buses used across York, primarily in the city. So if we're successful in achieving those two funding bids, the only diesel buses in York would be the interurban ones going out to places like Scarborough Hull, which are very difficult to convert. The other thing, of course, our bus service improvement plan does is it seeks to make bus service as inclusive and attractive as possible. A big part of it is a fares package, which is aimed particularly at reducing the cost of travel to younger people. We intend to bring in a flat fee. If we're funded by the Department of Transport, we've asked for £5 million to do this. We are intending to bring in a flat fare for younger people so that we can encourage younger people to use the bus as much as possible. We don't want to make it free because we don't want to make it so attractive that it discourages people from walking and cycling, but we do want to make it sufficiently inexpensive for it to be something that people can use very easily and can combat social exclusion that way. There are various other things that we are asking for in the bus service improvement plan, including a priorities package to improve reliabilities of the service, funding to improve punctuality through a series of small measures and just trying to keep traffic moving a bit better, and also some funding to improve bus stops and shelters. And I think it's important to make the point that actually, although this is a bus service improvement plan for York going forward, we already actually have very high levels of bus use in this city. As it stands at the moment, we have the 11th highest trip rate for bus use outside of London, out of the 80 local transport authorities. That's, we are unusual in that I think we've got 2/3 more bus users now than we had in 2000. So we're not an authority that's seen. Of course. So we're not an authority that's seen bus use trickle away at 2% a year like so many have. So we are already building on 30 years of pro-bus policies and investment.
Thank you. Yes, James.
I just think it might be useful for Julian to give you a bit of context about what bus service improvement plan is and why we've developed one, because it's something the government has pushed and the purpose of it.
Of course, I should have included that. So a national bus strategy was published on the 15th of March this year. It is quite a game changer. It comes with £3 billion of funding this Parliament, which is committed to improving bus services. If you take York, that funding is for England, but does not include London, and as far as we can tell, it doesn't include the Mets either. So if you pro rata that funding to York, it would imply a sum of about £30 million, which is a lot of investment to make in York's bus network. Obviously, we have no idea whether we will get the funding that we've asked for, but if we do get the funding we've asked for, it has potential to be a real game changer.
I just think it's important to stress that it's in effect a strategy requested by DfT, but is also a bidding document for funding. It's sort of an unusual process for government to do, but that's in effect what it is.
Thank you for that. And in terms, I mean, you've spoken about converting the fleet to electric buses and things like that. How does that work in the context of a series of private operators who put on services where they want and when they want?
Well, I suppose there's two sides of that. So first of all, the existing funding mechanism, which for reasons which are not clear to me is called Zebra, is designed to allow private companies to convert their buses to electric traction. So that's what it does. You know, it is a mechanism for it. So we can use it to invest in that. And actually the buses which I used on the Park and Ride service, although that service is operated under contract to us, those buses are actually owned by First Bus. So that is an example of that mechanism in use. So we know it in York and we've used it. So it's easy enough to do. In terms of changes to routes, this is something that's a bit of an unknown in the National Bus Strategy, in the sense that bus services are currently registered centrally by the Office of the Traffic Commissioner. There is a consultation coming out probably later this year over whether that registration should become local, in which case local authorities would be able to make more use of their controls over routes of buses. But that said, people say that bus routes change an awful lot, but it always strikes me that in the two bus networks I know really well, which are the bus network in York and the bus network in Leeds, the number one bus is on the main tram route. So, you know, it hasn't, you know, the principal urban transport route hasn't really changed.
Comments from anyone? Ideas? Yes. Councillor Melly and Councillor Pearson.
Thanks, and I look forward to reading the bus service improvement plan. That will be my evening reading tonight, I think. Yeah, one of the things that's needed is an enhanced partnership, isn't it? So does that help answer the question we had just now?
Yeah, the enhanced partnership is something that we have to deliver by the end of March, and that forces us into a statutory relationship with bus operators, which we don't have at the moment. We do have, York's a little bit unusual. We've had a voluntary partnership for 20 years. Not very many places have had those. So upgrading it to a statutory partnership will be less complicated than it would be in an area where there's been nothing before, but it does increase that control.
So does that mean there has been certain level of consultation already developing this plan with the operators and providers?
Yeah, we've had fairly extensive consultation with the operators and with our adjacent authorities as we've brought the plan forward. We've had some consultation with user groups as well.
And has there been more clarity now from the government on what's needed to be included to get the funding? Because they haven't been hasn't necessarily been completely clear, has it, on what the criteria are to actually get the funding, because it seems like there could be a lot. In terms of encouraging people to use the bus, it's very complicated. There's fares, clarity of fares, simplicity, the actual prices, frequency of buses, reliability of buses, the times they run, bus lanes, bus gates, accessibility. There's loads, isn't there? Is it all covered in this bus service improvement plan?
It's everything that the government has asked us to comment on is covered in the bus service improvement plan. Some of it is necessarily rather vague at the moment because it's, you know, in the time that we have available, it's not possible to put together a, you know, detailed costed set of bus priorities for York, for example, because that's a complicated thing to do, you know, costs money to do all the planning to change highways. And yeah, the government have not provided any particularly definitive guidance about what we should be bidding for. So, you know, in the absence of that, we've been taught, you know, there is a sort of industry grapevine, you know, between both us and other local authorities, which I suppose alongside the user consultation has broadly informed what we're bidding for. But it is a bit of a guessing game.
And my final question was about, because obviously you're here today, and thank you for being here and talking to us about it. And then is it going to be reviewed? Is the plan going to be reviewed every 6 months or every year, or when consultation happens anyway as part of big conversations? And is that review going to come to economy and place scrutiny, or are you going to be coming back to us? Or...
Well, there is a requirement to submit a review, to submit a refreshed BSIP every year, but the process for doing that hasn't been laid out yet. And one thing that we will have to do as we set up the enhanced partnership is work out how the governance of that works and how that functions within the CYC's political structures. So sorry, it's a slightly woolly answer, but
yes, yes, James.
I think I'm just going to say, I think the important point to note for those that aren't meshed into the way local government works, watching on YouTube or wherever, is that the bus service improvement plan needs to be submitted to government by the end of October. We are taking it through a decision session next Tuesday to the executive member for transport to approve that. Now that's us being as transparent as we can about the way these things are approved. Obviously, with more time and a year to review it, then we could look at whether that's scrutinised at which committees and developed. But that's an option for us about how we run the council in effect.
Thank you, Councillor Pearson.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Julian, for the update. I had a couple of questions. I think you've answered my first one, which was around if it's going to be a live strategy document and if it's going to be updated. That's good. I did have a question around, did you look at any specific routes for improvement? Did you look at things like service frequency improvements? And then my other question was around, you mentioned around this consultation at the moment about whether we could have more local controls. I just wondered, in your opinion, would that be a good thing for the authority? And is this something that this committee could maybe write to the relevant minister to say, you know, we think this is a good idea?
I think, okay, I'll answer those in turn. So in terms of looking at the network, there are actually quite a number of kind of moving pieces in the jigsaw at the moment. So we don't know what the mature, what bus patronage looks like in a sort of mature state. We don't know what the cost pressures are within the industry, because at the moment industry has some big problems about drivers and, you know, attracting enough drivers, and the network we have in York at the moment has quite a lot of routes that are on step back frequencies because there aren't enough drivers for them to operate what they operated pre-COVID. Obviously, we don't know what funding we're going to get from the DFT for the BSIP. We don't know what funding CYC will necessarily have to put into the bus network and supported services, and we don't know what funding might be available after the 2025 election. So we have to be very careful about how we manage all of these moving pieces. So nonetheless, the aspiration which is set out in the BSIP is for a network of urban routes that run every 10 minutes between 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. Monday to Friday, with similar frequencies on a Saturday and a lower frequency on Sundays and in the evenings. So I don't know whether that answers your question, Councillor Pitson.
Yeah, no, that's good to hear. And obviously, I would question the lower frequency on Sundays. You know, the leisure market is going to be a key driver, I think, for the economy more widely, and Sunday's obviously a key leisure day. But the only other thing was whether this government consultation on the levers and the routes, and whether it would be better to decentralise it. Is that something that this committee should perhaps consider whether we support that and want to, you know, lobby for it?
Yeah, local licensing services. I mean, I think it's one of these things where there are advantages and disadvantages, and we would probably have to think through what our response would be. I can certainly see advantages for having more, not exactly local control, but more local influence on what happens. But as I said, the situation in York is actually quite stable compared to some other places. I mean, we have agreed 6 change dates with the operators each year, and they stick to them, which is a much better situation than is the case elsewhere in the country. And even those, you know, 6 change dates, it sounds like a lot, but actually most of those are around university terms starting and ending, and stepping up and down the university bus services.
Thank you for that. I've got a couple of quick questions. The first is this: are we putting in our bus improvement plan a request for an electric shuttle bus service in the city centre? And the reason I asked, just so because obviously this is a public meeting so that the public can understand this, our twin city of Dijon, York's twin city, has an electric shuttle bus service with 29 stops, all of which are accessible for wheelchair users. And it runs every 20 minutes. And it occurs to me, having seen it in operation, that it could transform the whole debate we've had this year about blue badge holders by providing a viable, easy way for people with mobility problems to get right around their city centre, and at the same time provide an opportunity for other residents to catch connections, and for tourists visiting our city to get from the station to their hotel with heavy luggage. So we've kind of talked about it on and off now for 6 months. I'm just keen to know if we're going to submit that as part of our bid to transform buses.
Okay, well, within the BSIT, there is a request for £50,000 to do a detailed feasibility study of just that. If the feasibility study concludes that it's, you know, but a sensible and achievable thing to do, there is obviously a large revenue ask for improved services which could potentially be used to fund it.
So we are taking a step towards it in this document.
Yes.
Councillor Melly, yeah.
I was just going to say there is a question about that, isn't there, in the current city centre access consultation that's live at the moment.
Yes.
So hopefully that will result in good feedback and help make the case of the need for it.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of issues, isn't it? One of which is making sure that we get a service, as you say, that people want to use. The other bit of the study we'll need to look at is the commercial arrangements for that. As Julian alluded to, what we've got is a promise from government of very significant funding in a very short period of time. A bus service, unless we manage to pump prime it and find the commercial route for it, then becomes a revenue burden for the authority. This authority spends around 800k a year on subsidising bus services in the city. It would need to make some decisions about, you know, does that become a different bus subsidy? So it's not an easy decision for the authority to make, given the way government are promising the funding. So that's why we've taken this approach of actually what's the business case and how do we make it work? As you'll be aware, we ran a sort of taxi service as part of the initial response in COVID, which actually wasn't that well received by blue badge holders. So I think what we've learned from that experience is we really need to engage and make sure we've got the right business case and not jump straight into a knee-jerk solution that actually doesn't work for our communities.
Yes, and then I think Councillor Wan, did you raise your hand? Yeah, so, yeah.
That 800k a year, is that all subsidies? So kind of subsidising routes that aren't so commercially viable and reduced fares for, is it over 65?
No, it's what we spend on subsidising routes which are not commercially viable. The senior citizens support, I think, is about 4.5 million a year.
Okay, Councillor Wan.
Yeah, I was just wondering if it also looked at how buses interacted with other forms of transport and whether it strayed as far as looking at community transport as well, or whether it was just looking at commercial type bus services.
No, the government guidance is quite clear that BSIP should consider what's called Section 19 provision, which is in York is represented by the Dull and Ride provision, but also consider things like taxis and private hire. It's quite, what you call public transport is actually very wide ranging. It's everything from rail, arguably including air, down to taxis and bicycle rickshaws and things like that. So the BSIP should be certainly cognizant of all of that. There is a question about to what extent you can have, some areas have what are called mobility partnerships where, it's the bus operators, but also Section 19 taxis, private hire vehicles. There's a nod to that in the, one important feature of the BSIP, which really needs, if one thing gets funded, it's the most important thing, and actually it's one of the cheapest, is for £50,000 a year funding for an officer to pull all of this together. And there are opportunities in the way that we change the existing quality bus partnership into an enhanced partnership to incorporate other things within it.
Thank you. I'll ask my second question now, if I may. It's about data. One thing that stares out at me when I've watched the local transport plan being pulled together is that we appear to be so heavily reliant on census data that's 10 years old to understand how many people are using walking, how many people are cycling, etc., etc. And I'd be really pleased to kind of get an idea of how you think going forwards, how useful it would be to actually do what they do in the Netherlands, say, and I think we've done once in York, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but to make use of smartphone data, to get real-time data, up-to-date information, so we actually know on, let's say at random, 3 times a year, we buy the phone data the same way Tesco's buy phone data and everyone else does, and actually have a clear picture of who's going where and how they're doing it from the smartphones. Because when we all sit in the car as citizens and we're going to Leeds and someone says, are we going to get to the cinema on time? And you check on Google, we know whether we're going to get there on time based on the movement of smartphones along that road. And we're all perfectly happy to do that. Is there a case for York to get hold of that data so that as we shape this new local transport plan, we're working on up-to-date data on how people are getting across our city and pulling in the kind of thing that Councillor Wan said there about community transport. My understanding is that with smartphone data, you can actually start to know whether a journey is done partly on the bus and partly on foot, etc., which, as I understand it, our current data leaves us completely in the dark about. So I'd just like to get a feeling for how you think we might usefully use data going forwards.
It's almost worth a session on itself, is this. York's just launched what I think in the UK is the first live transport model. So we are absolutely at the cutting edge in terms of our transport model. We can access and plug into that transport model various forms of data. So during COVID, we've been working closely with the BID to collect credit card information about purchases so we can see where people are going. And Claire can probably talk to you more about that than I can, if I'm honest. We have run pilots with the DfT to collect that mobile phone data, as you talk about, and the transport model is absolutely ready to plug that information in. And we've built the platform that holds all this data as well. So the transport model will sit there and can turn it around very quickly. Previously, when you wanted to run the transport model, you would switch it on and program it, normally about this sort of time of day, and come back the next day hoping it hadn't crashed and had come out with an answer. The live transport model allows us to do that in a very real way and run scenarios sort of there and then. So I think we're in a very positive place. I think the art is in working out, in amongst all this data that we can have, what is really valuable and what will change our decision making. Because the danger with big data is it can sit there and actually, there's so much to look at that you get lost in a circle. So I think what is important is starting to look at what are the outcomes we want to measure out of the transport model, not just the inputs and where people are moving. So the way we've designed the transport model is that can measure a variety of things. Historically, transport models have looked at travel time and that being an important factor, but actually the way we've designed it is actually we can plug in things like air quality, for instance, and start to drive the transport model to deliver outcomes on air quality as opposed to just transport delivery, of journey times. So I think it's probably worth, we could bring you a paper on that if that was of interest to you as a committee about how the transport model that we've just delivered has changed from the old-fashioned transport model that the city used to have.
I certainly think it might be of value to a future meeting to see how data might be used. Do members think so? Do you agree? That would be good. Yes, Councillor Melly.
I would find it really interesting. I'd definitely like to see it. Is this the most appropriate committee for it?
I'm not entirely sure. We can ask the question. I think what's important is that information is seen, that we do engage with the options. Yes, Claire.
I wonder if the paper could look at how the live transport model can influence decisions around climate change and reducing carbon. So just as you described, air quality. Maybe that's the way to do it. Thank you.
That might be helpful. And I'm aware that Leeds and Vienna, for example, use a modelling system called Mars that enables them to put in specific questions about how do we reduce carbon emissions by 10% across the city, and then play with different parameters. So that would seem to be talking to the same thing you're talking about, Claire. So maybe a report that looked at modelling and data, smart data, and in the context of how it can feed into delivering a zero carbon pathway would be helpful for this committee. Is that something that we might expect going forwards? Would that be something?
Yeah, I can talk to the transport modelling team about bringing a paper that looks at introducing the new transport model, explaining to you what that does and how that can drive different agendas. That's not a problem.
That would be fantastic. Unless there are any other questions, I think we'll move on, and thank you very much for waiting patiently.
It's quite all right.
For so long. Thank you. So we now move on to agenda item 6, the emissions update, on pages 35 to 80. So, yes.
I'm sure you've read it. So just as a snapshot for people listening at home, we've got 2 reports for you. One that explains the City of York Council's emissions, and one which provides an overview on the City of York emissions, so 2 different things. It's worth noting that the City of York Council emissions only account for less than 4% of total citywide emissions. So, and there's a number of actions in the paper that we propose taking that will help reduce that even further. reduce our emissions even further and contribute to that wider net zero target. There's also in the paper some information about carbon emissions for home working. So it gives you an overview on the current changes to how we work and what that might mean for our emissions going forward. And it also provides a procurement paper around a sustainable procurement model, which is really just to look at. There's an awful lot of detail in it. But very happy to take questions on City of York Council emissions, and then we'll go on to City of York emissions, just to keep the two things separate, if that's okay, Chair. Yeah, thank you.
Understood. And it's an important point to make at the start, because this committee has on previous occasions rehearsed the difference between declaring a zero carbon city and declaring a zero carbon council.
Exactly that.
And this puts that into some context and shows, firstly, just how large the challenge is for the whole city. And secondly, the scale of ambition that the council can have to deliver a zero carbon council, and how it has a leadership role to inspire change across the city. So yes, there are a whole load of statistics here on everything from electricity use and gas use and water use, figures on the electricity use in our buildings and in our street lighting. I note, and I'm really pleased this has happened, that the council has switched to 100% renewable energy. And that's a very good thing. We are still in positions of challenge, shall we say, on how we use electricity, because we can surely be pleased that we're using renewable energy, but we're still paying bills for stuff. And that too is part of the energy transition. And it would be good to have some thoughts actually from you, Sean, I think, on the way in which, for example, we pay electricity for our street lighting, how that takes place, what context we have on there, how things have changed in the past few years, how it's metered or not metered, just giving us a sense of the context of that, because the figure is that we're spending, according to this, £800,000 a year on electricity to streetlights. We were paying £600,000 a year when I was involved in a street lighting scrutiny topic in 1824 or whenever it was, 2008, I think. And here we are a decade later, 14 years later, still paying a huge sum of money, and yet I think we're improving the energy efficiency of our bulbs. So where are we? How is all that working? And how might we do better going forward, Sean, do you think?
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, just a quick point of clarification that we purchase 100% renewable electricity. There is no way to guarantee that we use 100% renewable electricity, because our power comes from National Grid, which is a mix of energy generated from sources at that time, but we do purchase 100% renewable electricity. So since April 2020, so last year, for street lighting is unmetered currently, which means we don't measure how much electricity we use. It's calculated on an estimate of the number of lamps and time of use. To get more information, I think I'd want to speak with the head of that service specifically, but I do know that we've, James is waving at me. James can give you some more info.
So yes, the way street lighting works, because they're not on a metered network, they're plugged straight into MPG's network. Each year we submit a register, a list, asset register, that's what I'm looking for, of all our columns and the hours they will operate, and they send us a bill. When we move columns over to LED lamps, that bill reduces. So there was a big reduction in the bill 3.5 years ago, I think, when we did the big program of LED rollout. And next time round, when we submit it, there'll be another reduction as we continue to roll out new columns and new lamp heads. So, although, I mean, it's the nature of buying energy, isn't it? It doesn't come down in price, but actually the amount we are using is going down because of those changes.
Can I just follow up, James, by asking you, as we switch to LED streetlights, we're swapping the ballasts, we're presumably able to control when the lights come on and on, we're presumably recording that data for ourselves. When we say the street lighting is unmetered, are we allowing the energy company just to estimate what we're using, or are we sending them figures for what we are actually using?
Well, we send them a spec of the hours it will operate, the type of bulb that's in the lamp head, and there's a negotiation and a tender process ultimately on a periodic basis to make sure we get as good a price as we can. The problem is, because we are plugged into National Grid, there's a not national, Northern Power Grid. There is, you know, it's not like being on a meter at home where you can just, you know, swap energy provider every week to make sure you get the best deal. Unfortunately,
and
so there is a certain
of
amount of price flex from the energy companies to reflect the fact that actually they want to make sure they make the same amount of money that we do. You know, if we said we're going to turn all our street lights off and they're only going to run for an hour, our price per unit, I think, would go up quite considerably.
And are we now in a place where we could say, or maybe we already do it, I'd just like to understand this, where we could reduce the energy to our street lighting at 3 in the morning till 7 in the morning in winter when everyone's asleep, reduce it by 50%, you'd still be lighting the roads, but you'd be saving a lot of power and reducing your bills and reducing consumption of electricity. Are we doing that? Are we able to do it?
It's much easier to do once you're on 100% LED. Once you're on 100% LED, the ability to dial down, turn off, those sorts of things is much easier than when you're on a mixed market where we might want to, because we don't have the controllers and all the existing units to be able to sort of dial them up and down in the way you're describing. Once they're all moving over to LED, that becomes an easier process.
How far away do you think we are from being there? I'm sorry, I'm kind of hogging this because it's, for me, it's really interesting just to see the progress we've been making in lighting. And when we get to that point that you've just described, which to me is an interesting point, where suddenly you can go to the energy company, all our bulbs are like this, we know exactly what we're doing, we're saving 30% every night by doing this, please can you cut our bulbs, our bills?
Yeah, as I say, I think the energy consumption will go down. I'm not always convinced the bill will go down, just to be clear. But the important bit is energy consumption in terms of this committee. I think, I can't remember off the top of my head, I've read it in the last 2 weeks as well, so it's slightly frustrating. It's somewhere between, I'm saying 2/3 and 3/4 that are LED, but I'll drop Joseph a note.
I think it's 12,000 out of 19,000. I think it's in this report, which is about what you've just described.
Yeah. And do we have an idea of how quickly we're going to reach that end point? Is there a program to get there?
Capital program to replace columns at the moment. Our primary focus is on replacing the columns that are closest to collapsing effects. So it's a structural program at the moment, but obviously when we're changing the structures, we put the LED bulbs in at the same time.
Thank you. Yes, Councillor Perry.
Just coming in on this conversation, I would just urge caution when we talk about potentially reducing lighting at night. So declaring conflict of interest here, I do work for a women's charity, and I think it would make some residents quite nervous to think that there wouldn't be as much street lighting. So I would just sort of, want to sound a note of caution here that, we need to think about this really carefully in terms of sort of overall safety for everyone. But I've said my piece.
That's okay. I understand the thought, and it relates to the scrutiny topic we did in 2009, because we actually changed the amount of energy to the bulbs on outside the library and in one of the car parks, and reduced the energy by, I think it was 25 to 30%. And no one could tell the difference. We had people going up and down. The fear of streets being dark is obviously entirely warranted, and I understand it. The reality of the amount of reduction you can put to the energy of a bulb and still have a well-lit street is often not understood, as we discovered. And obviously safety is paramount, but I think personally from what I saw that there are significant savings to be made, as long as what I think James was intimating there, you don't go to the energy company and say, oh, that's great, thanks, we're still charging the same amount of money, which presumably is something one would challenge. But I understand the point you make, Councillor Parrott. Yes.
Yeah, just picking up on Councillor Parrott's point from a different hat, we would test it obviously with residents and with women's charities to make sure we're not reducing the perception, creating a perception of fear. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think it's worth noting that in Oslo, whenever it snows, they reduce the energy to the bulb by 40% because of the light coming reflected off the street from the snow. And it's what those kinds of local authorities have been doing for a long time to manage carbon emissions and manage bills. And it's the kind of innovation that certainly I've been wanting to see for a very long time. Councillor Melly.
I was just going to say, I hope we don't have such climate catastrophe that we've got a lot of snow regularly in York. That would be,
just a few days.
Try and prevent that.
Okay, are there any other points people want to make on the council's emissions? Yes, Councillor Melly.
Not on street lighting, but if we're moving on. Cool. Yeah, I was going to ask a question about what you were saying about purchasing energy versus using energy and stuff. Does the council currently produce or own any renewable energy? Like we've got a biomass boiler, haven't we? Do we have any investments in solar farms or any wind turbines or whatever?
We have local generation on some of our buildings. All of that, I think, is used for self-consumption. So we consume all of the electricity we generate ourselves. Our electricity consumption is much larger than what we generate ourselves. So that's why the majority of it comes from National Grid.
So is improving that likely to be part of the climate change strategy?
I think we've done a study not that long ago and have almost exhausted the options for renewable generation on our own buildings, but we can locate renewable generation in other locations across the city, and looking into that will definitely be part of the local area energy planning.
I would add that we have solar canopies on 2 of the park and ride sites. So they are significant generators of power.
Yes, and whilst I know it's controversial, obviously Allerton Park is an energy from waste facility itself, and there is a gas generator at Harewood Wind from the old landfill site as well, which feeds directly into the grid.
Yeah, and in response to that, I remember being told in 2010 that the Allerton Energy from Waste plant, if it was supplying district heating as well as generating electricity, could heat 30,000 homes. And it's certainly something that I'm hoping in terms of the devolution ask that York and North Yorkshire County Council are assembling, that we do our level best to ensure that the energy from waste plant provides district heating, if not to York, then to Harrogate, because that too will be a measurable carbon reduction that the city can factor in going forwards. So that's an opportunity that has been sitting there, and I've been reassured. I've been assured last time I went to Allerton that actually the plant is set up with all the kit in place to provide district heating as and when the local authorities decide they want to take the heat away from the plant. Which I thought was interesting and an opportunity for us going forwards. So yes, sorry, did you have a follow-up question there, Rachel? No. Okay, are there any other comments on the energy? Completely different question, Rachel.
Well, I don't know, a question or a concern or point of discussion, I don't know. You were saying that the city's emissions are less than 4%, the council's emissions are less than 4% of the city's emissions, but that's only scope 1 and 2, isn't it?
Yes.
So while obviously it's really, really important to reduce or even hopefully eliminate our scope 1 and 2 emissions, my concern is that it's scope 3, is there a scope 4? Okay, scope 3 emissions are probably vastly the main emissions as a council. And then there's other stuff which maybe we can invent a scope for, I don't know, like transport and stuff, where we have a huge amount of influence because we, as a council, manage all the infrastructure for walking, cycling, public transport, private vehicle, hackney cabs, everything. And like scope 1 and 2, really important to make improvements, but they're the kind of quickest, easiest changes to make, and they only account for a tiny proportion of our emissions as a council. And actually, possibly 80 or 90% of our emissions as a council are going to be vastly more difficult, more expensive, more controversial, more difficult in terms of infrastructure and stuff. It's going to take a lot longer to do. And if we are only looking at scope 1 and 2 now, it's going to be, by the time we actually get round to scope 3 and everything else, it's going to be too late to achieve the changes that we need by 2030, or, you know, if that deadline keeps slipping. That's kind of a concern I had from this report.
Yeah, noted, thank you. I think scope 3 emissions are extremely difficult to calculate. That's why we started with scope 1 and 2. And it's also the actions that are directly under our influence and our control. There is an action within this report to work with York and North Yorkshire LEP to create a methodology for calculating our scope 3 emissions so that we can get to the same place with scope 3 that we are right now with scope 1 and 2. It's a challenge, but we're working towards it.
Yes, Jane.
I think just to say that whilst I wouldn't disagree with anything that's been said, and I would agree with Sean. I think what I would say is that actually the fact that we are working on LTP and reflecting the fact that LTP has to work with a carbon strategy reflects the fact that we are starting that conversation, and you know, we started that through that engagement about what some of those, I'm not going to use your words, but bigger challenges and more difficult decisions are going to be, because that's, you know, that is part of what LTP will need to address, is how we drive those changes.
And am I right in thinking one of our public speakers raised the issue of transport for staff coming to work? Am I right in thinking that's part of scope 3 emissions? And that as we go down the road, we will need to start quantifying that as part and parcel of understanding how we become a zero carbon council, to start engaging with those kinds of emissions.
Yeah, regular commuting is scope 3. Travel associated for business is within our scope 1 and 2 and is included within the report. Understandably, that was massively reduced last year, so any form of comparison is fairly redundant from what was consumed.
So eventually we're going to have to, if we're going to nail it, as you say, the scale of the challenge that Councillor Melly points out, we're going to have to start to engage with all that kind of scope 3 stuff, includes councillors as well, I should say, to get to the bottom of how we reach a zero carbon city or a zero carbon council.
We probably need to, yes, absolutely don't disagree with that at all. We probably just need to make the distinction between scope 3 and council or scope 3 and city, because actually scope 3 and council we have some influence over. Scope 3 and city is much, much harder and more challenging to influence. In fact, it's going to be a challenge for us to influence scope 1 and 2. So we probably need to be mindful of what's achievable with city.
Yeah, now that point's well made. And at an earlier meeting this year, we looked at the fact that if for example, the City Council retrofits all its council buildings, all its council homes, on one level you can say we've reduced our carbon emissions to zero, but if all the inhabitants of those homes save money on their energy bill and go off on a holiday to the Seychelles or whatever it is, you achieve no saving at all. And so actually that big picture requires all of us, or we don't ever get anywhere at all. Yes, Sean.
Thanks, Chair. I just want to make a point of some really big positives that are in the report. We presented it as a warts and all. These are the challenges that we've got, and we've got some big challenges. Decarbonising our large office buildings is going to be really challenging over the next 10 years. But there's some huge positives. The 100% purchase of renewable electricity last year is a big positive. And also our fleet is the biggest contributor to our emissions right now. But our fleet decarbonisation programme will mean that over the next 4 years, all of our own vehicles under 3.5 tonne will switch to electric, and that will have a huge impact on our scope 1 and scope 2 emissions as a council. So there are some really big challenges, but there's also some really big positives in the report as well.
That's really good to hear, and thank you for reminding us, because we can all get bogged down in the scale of the challenge and never take the time out to register the steps we're taking and how we're getting there. So there's a good point. Are there any other points on the council's emissions? And if not, shall we kind of just look at the city as a wider picture?
So city emissions starts on page 73.
Yeah.
Yeah. Again, it's worth looking at that. This is again scope 1 and scope 2. What's helpful, I think, is if we look at the pie chart on page 78, I think that is, 74, apologies, and it just shows you where the bulk of our scope 1 and scope 2 city emissions are placed, really, with the predominance in buildings. Domestic buildings 31.8%, non-domestic buildings, office blocks, etc. 30.1%, and then transport at 27.9%. So earlier in today we were talking about resident engagement and how the focus is on reusing plastic bottles and changing plastic to glass or whatever, and actually we do have an education piece to do to talk about to the residents about where we can get the maximum gain from. So if you bring in resident engagement and the emissions reports together, it helps us understand the gap, if you like, the gap in knowledge, and where we need to change that behaviour and where we need to kind of prompt that conversation. So just that's really why we brought the two things together, because actually it tells you the whole picture of what we need to try and achieve through the climate change strategy.
Yeah.
Thank you.
The point is well made, because what that questionnaire showed us is the significant dislocation between what people think the problem is and what the problem is. And until we bring those two things together, it's hard to have a constructive conversation that's going to take us all in the right direction. So that feeds back to what we were saying earlier about the exhibition that is a small exhibition or whatever. I mean, personally, I'd be happy to have a larger exhibition in the street, and I've said so on many occasions, because I think fundamentally, until we're all talking and raising our information levels, it's going to be very hard. Because people can we don't know, the classic thing is we don't know what we don't know. And so people just rehearse the little part of the story. As you say, those charts are very helpful in helping us to see where the challenge lies. And the chart on page 77 similarly pins down the role of transport in all of this. Yeah, it's a bit unfortunate that it's in black and white. Oh, right, okay. Some of us have it in full colour. And I realise, I keep thinking this while we're talking, and I feel I have to say this before the meeting ends, that I didn't properly introduce Sean or Claire. and that the members of the public might not actually understand who it is we've got around the table. So before this ends, anyone who's got the stamina to be here at the end, Claire Fole is the Assistant Director for Policy and Strategy, and Sean Gibbons is the Head of Carbon Reduction. And again, to make sure we've got total clarity, we've had Julian Ridge, Sustainable Transport Manager, who introduced himself, and James Gilchrist, Assistant Director for Transport. So for all those who've looked in, you now know who is around the table. Do I need to declare the councillors? No, I think we've done that all the way through. Good. So are there any more comments that people want to make at this stage on the report that we've got here? I think that at this meeting, we're just noting all of this, and it's all stuff that's in development and in train. So
yeah, I think perhaps of interest to you, Chair, is that this report, the Citywide emissions report, forms the basis for our submission to the Carbon Disclosure Project and the Global Covenant of Mayors as well. So that's part of the process.
And we wanted to bring it to you today because obviously the next time we meet, we'll be talking about the climate change strategy, of which all of this evidence informs. So it's really important that you understand and you know where all this came from and what it means. And just as a final point, on page 81, we're looking at the work plan for next year, for the next session. Obviously, we've already added another one into the economic development strategy, just to note that, Chair.
yeah.
Thank you.
And again, in closing all of this, because what you've just told us about how this is informing the strategy, are these data sets more recent than some of the data sets that we've been using? Because I know that we're always at least 2 years behind on energy consumption figures that come via 15 departments and so on and so forth. How up to date is this information? How much confidence do you have in it?
Corporate emissions are from 2020, 2021, so very recent, last financial year. Citywide emissions, I think as we've reported before, there's always at least a 2.5 year time lag between collecting the data and being able to report on the data. So the information in this report relates to 2018.
Do you get the impression, Sean, because you're at the heart of this, do you get the impression that government is aware of the value of trying to get real-time data to bear on all of this? Because they're working endlessly with huge arrears. I mean, the figures we've got that you've just described don't even know a pandemic's going to happen.
That's true.
We've been living through it for 1.5 years, but the figures are blissfully unaware. So
that's
do you
true.
think, is there more that the council could be doing in terms of communicating with government? What's your impression about where we're going with this?
I think there's a huge number of data sources that make up this modelling, and that they have their own resource pressures at national government, at BEIS, who's responsible for publishing this data. I don't know the direction of what the urgency is there of making this data more timely.
Yeah.
Councillor Pearson, actually, I think he's gone now, but Councillor Pearson mentioned maybe there's an opportunity for Scrutiny to think about a letter to write to government. I mean, maybe you'd like to consider, I mean, I don't know whether it'll make any difference, but it will at least raise the issue with the people who can make a difference. So it might be something to think about.
Yes, or to seek to persuade full council to do the same and have a letter going from the chief operating officer or whatever, but yes. Okay, thank you very much. Nothing more on this item.
Should we formally resolve to do that?
Sorry?
Should we formally resolve to do that?
Yes, if everyone's happy to do that, that we put a letter together on behalf of the Scrutiny Committee, or that we ask the executive consider a motion to full council. What would you like to see?
I am not completely sure on what powers we have as a committee. Can we ask the executive member for climate change to write a letter or something? I don't know, yeah, or, because then it comes from the council as a local authority,
Yeah.
right? If she signs it.
And specifically for the letter, just to make sure I'm understanding what you're saying then, for the letter to say to government, we want more contemporary data to inform us
Yeah,
in our strategic work.
yeah,
Well, I'll have a conversation with the executive member and maybe with Claire and Sean, if you're happy with that, to see how we might formulate such a request so that it's understood. Yeah.
or
Is
does it have
everyone
more
happy with
weighting if
that?
it's like a joint letter from the executive member and the scrutiny committee or something? I don't know.
Yeah, we'll have a chat about it after the meeting and see how we can assemble something. But it certainly feels that things need to be said because we're struggling with old data. Yeah.
It's probably worth noting as well, everybody's in the same position. So we might have a conversation about whether we can join forces, talk to other authorities and see whether we can do something together.
Yeah.
Yeah.
At the very least, since we're doing the devolution talks with North Yorkshire County
Exactly.
Council. Yeah.
Let's have a conversation offline and see where the best place to do that might be.
Yeah, good idea. Okay, thanks. Very good. So we're almost at the end. It's been a long meeting, as it always is. That's climate change agenda for us, really, isn't it? The work plan. So you mentioned something that was going to be added to this earlier. The economic development plan, yeah. Yes, and there was something else we were talking about earlier about so local transport,
The
yes.
transport modelling and the
Transport modelling.
impacts it might have on climate change using live transport data. So cold.
When might be a good idea to do that? So we've got, I'm looking at half of this has gone now, hasn't it? So we've got a meeting, an informal meeting on the 30th of November. Would that be time enough to produce something, James?
In theory, yes.
In theory, yes.
So yes, let me go away and talk to the team, but yes, in theory, there's plenty of time for us to put together a paper and presentation for you on the new transport model and how that works.
Brilliant. Okay. So
Although, sorry, just as a question, I wonder if it marries into the item on the 12th of January about the local transport plan. So actually, you've got an update about the local transport plan and some of the data that might inform it. If that works.
Possibly. The only thing I would say is you might want to spend all your time on local transport plan and never look at transport model. That's the only danger.
yeah, I suspect it would be, we would learn more by just tackling it separately and then being informed by that when we look at the other stuff. Yes.
So if we're going to have a report by the next meeting, that's only kind of 5 weeks or something, because we'd need to be sent it before the head of the meeting. But if we're not doing it on the, so that, I mean, that feels ambitious, I know. You're busy. So then if we weren't doing it on the 12th of January with the local transport plan, then that leaves us all the way till March, which just feels really a long way off. So
As I say,
I feel like you either need to be able to do it in 5 weeks or it needs to be tied into local transport.
I think we will try and write you a paper. It might not answer all your questions, but I think if we can start with a paper that gives you an introduction to the transport model and how that varies from previous variations in terms of what we can measure and the outputs we can do and how it works. I think that would be a good starting point. As I say, I think it may pose as many questions as it answers, because these things always do, but we'll give it a go to try and hit your 30th of November deadline.
Yeah. And this doesn't require a whole report, but something's just come to my mind as we're talking about all of that. And it's actually to thank officers for what's happened over the past few months, that I was badgering the council for 17 years to do a trial of rubberized road surfaces. And it happened in August in Weldrake. And I was really pleased that that happened, and it's a great job. And when you drive over it, you immediately hear the roads quieter, quite apart from the cut in carbon emissions and the use of old tyres and the circular economy. What pleased me even more, and I'd like to say this publicly, is the fact that within 6 weeks of that happening, I know that the highways team have used the same surface in at least 2 other locations, which is a good sign going forwards, because and presumably will feed into our Zero Carbon Council, because laying that road surface, I understand, reduces carbon emissions by 8% compared to a standard surface. So I just want to welcome all of that and use a platform to note it, because it's the kind of thing that councils, local authorities do, that fly past in the night, no one ever notices, but is integral to the business of transforming a city. So I wanted to note that. So transport modelling, what else is on your radar, Claire, for that November meeting?
So I think we've probably got transport model, economic strategy in stage
And it's the
3,
economic strategy,
and
isn't it?
then anything we can bring about the climate change strategy, which you know, by the November sessions, it's at the end of November, we should have taken that to the public for stage 3 consultation. So it'd be good to have a conversation with you here about it as well.
Thank you. And we've not yet got anywhere in here anything about someone coming from the Climate Commission to talk to this committee, talk with this committee. It would be good to find somewhere to be able to do that, even if it's the informal meeting in March, to finally make that point of contact.
Commission. I do sit here. I can bring verbal updates if you like.
Sorry, I didn't mean you, Sean. What I meant was one of the other stakeholders. In particular, I'll be honest with you, what I would really like to see is someone coming from the hospital, so that we get a clear idea in this committee, and the public gets a chance to hear.
Would you like them to represent the commission, or would you like them to represent the hospital in that case? Because we could just invite a representative.
Just invite
from the
one
hospital
representative.
to come in.
I'd certainly be happy with that. I don't know what others think. Sorry, yes.
I think they're holding a public event in November. Is it the 10th of November, about buildings and building emissions? As committee members, maybe we should all go along to that and meet some of the members ourselves and support that event.
Yeah, could you circulate that information?
Certainly can, yeah. It's a joint event with the City of York Council and York Climate Commission on the 10th of November, as you said, Councillor. It's net zero carbon buildings event. So it's people who own a building. That can be anyone from a private homeowner to a huge asset portfolio owner. And there will be 15 to 20 solution providers at that event, showcasing their technologies, helping those building owners to reduce their carbon emissions and their energy bills as well. Information is on Eventbrite, and we're also promoting it through all our social media channels as well.
And we'll add it to the minutes of this meeting, so it's recorded.
Thanks, Claire.
Yeah, Joe.
Thank you very much for that. Thanks for bringing that up. It would be good to go to that. Unless there's any urgent business that people want to bring up, I think that's it. Thank you very much to everyone for your time.